Let me just get this up and running. You've done a great introduction, so I haven't got to say too much, but in terms of social learning, I've been focusing a lot on the social learning tools and techniques and trends over the last few years, and wanted to share some of my thoughts with you today. I work as an independent consultant, but I'm also part of an alliance of consultants from around the world. Some of you might recognize some of these faces here. I work with J. Cross and Clark in the US, and Harold Jarkey and John Husband in Canada, and Charles and myself in the UK. And we work together as a consortium, an alliance, if you like. We call ourselves Internet Time Alliance. And over the last few years, we've been looking at the way that social media has influenced learning and work, and what impact it's going to have on learning and development over the coming years. And recently I wrote a short piece called The State of Social Learning and some thoughts for the future of learning and development. And so today, in this very short time, I'd like to present some of the sort of findings from that piece, and then provide you with a link to it so you can follow that through if you'd like to. Now, it's clear that the emergence of social media over the last few years has really taken hold in many ways that it's changed the way we all interact and connect with each other on the web. And it's affected all areas of our lives. And in fact, it's already been called a revolution in the ways that people are changing and their way that work and, in fact, learning is changing. There was a great presentation about last summer that provided some statistics of just how important social media has become for many people. And just a few things I took from it. YouTube, for instance, is now the number 2 largest search engine in the world. If Facebook were a country, it would be the 4th largest. And Wikipedia has something like over 13 million articles on it. So it's not just a fad anymore. People are really making great use of these tools. And every year I ask learning professionals around the world to contribute their top 10 tools for learning. And this year, last year, 2009, about 300 people contributed with their top tools. And from that, I create something called the top 100 tools, as Clive has mentioned. And it will probably be no surprise to you, if you haven't already seen that list, that the top 10 included a large number of social media tools. And often when I'm presenting this to people, they look at it and say, yeah, well, they're social media tools, but these are just everyday tools. These aren't really tools for learning. And often they ask me, well, how can Twitter, or as you saw, Twitter was the number 1 tool last year, how can Twitter or any social media tool, in fact, be used for learning? So that's clearly the big question on people's minds. So last year I spent some time analysing those contributions for the list, and I drew out 100 examples, or more than 100 examples, of how people are using specific tools within a learning context. I also began to collate documented examples of the ways organisations were using social media in the workplace. And from that list, I tried to analyse how people were specifically using these for learning. Now, it's become quite fashionable to talk about learning in terms of formal learning and informal learning, but I identified 5 different ways that people are using social media for learning within the organisation. So I'd briefly like to sort of explain these 5 categories that I've come up with. The first is quite clearly the most obvious one, the one that most people define as learning, the formal, structured education and training that takes place, workshops, classes, and so forth, are pushed to people. Just random examples of how social media is being used within these areas. Libraries of course links using social bookmarking tools, wikis to create class spaces for allowing collaborative activities, social networking sites to create communities of learners around a formal learning course or workshop. In terms of how they're doing this, well, in education, who are making significantly more use of social media for these formal structured learning approaches. They're using course management systems which have a variety of social media embedded within them, whereas in the corporate world, the learning management system doesn't have, in many cases, these social media elements, so they're having to add onto them the free tools, perhaps, to provide that extra activity and social connectedness they need. So what's happening in many cases within the formal environment, that social media just being tacked on to the end or added on as an afterthought, whereas in education we're seeing much more integrated or completely participative use of social media for formal learning. So that's one category, but significantly we're seeing that individuals are making use of social media tools for their own personal learning, their personal directed learning. That's for their both personal and professional learning within and without the organization. For accessing content, information and instructional content, and for making connections with people. They're building what we like to call their own personal learning environments or networks, something which perhaps isn't a sort of well-defined term within corporate learning, and is something that's taking place largely outside the organization because the tools aren't there to support them. They're making considerable use of social networking tools for interaction with people and asking questions of each other outside the organization. They're using social bookmarking tools to create their own bookmarks and sharing them with their network of people. But as I say, most of that is largely taking place outside of the organization. Within education, personal learning is a concept that has been sort of well regarded for many years, and the idea is they're trying to bring that much more in-house, but certainly in workplace learning we're seeing it taking place outside of the organization. The third category is group-directed learning. This is where we're seeing lots of groups of individuals choosing to, who are in teams or want to work together, making use of social media tools like group spaces, collaborative tools, even social bookmarking tools, and certainly microblogging tools to work together to build a community within a group. And once again, because many of the organizational tools are not there to support this kind of activity, they're using free social tools to do just that. And the fourth area I'm seeing is that where organizations are seeing the bigger picture, they're realizing that individuals employees need to communicate across the organization, to share information across the organization. There is some movement in creating social activities to support that. For instance, we're seeing blogging by managers and project leaders to keep people up to date with what's happening in the organization. We're seeing certain organizations create file sharing systems where employees can create and share and comment on different types of files. And in fact, Peter's going to be talking about that, an example of that later on. We're seeing creation of in organizations, the creation of organizational communities and networks for people to locate contacts and colleagues with related interests. And whereas it might seem obvious that this kind of activity should be high on the agenda for an organization, it appears that these enterprise systems are perhaps not as obvious as they should be, and not as happening as much as they should be. And I think there's a point here that who takes responsibility for creating such a system. And then fifthly, another way, the final way that seeing social media tools being used is in what I call accidental and serendipitous learning. This is where individuals are learning without even realizing it. It's also called incidental or random learning. It's the kind of learning that takes place when you go, Americans say, at the water cooler, at the coffee bar, or wherever you're just chatting with people, you find out things. Now, clearly it's not something that organizations have really been that bothered about, but it is happening in those places. And in fact, we're finding that individuals are putting themselves into positions where they're likely to find out things that they might not know. They're joining networks. They're joining microblogging services like Twitter in order that they might accidentally or serendipitously find some information. So I think for the message for organizations is that whereas this might be something that's not of interest, it's about providing more opportunities for this to take place. So if we put the 5 different activities together, what we're finding is that whereas there's still quite a lot of activity in the formal structured learning area, that we're seeing all individuals creating their own personal learning environments within and without the organization, creating groups, spaces for activities within the organization, and a lot of some sort of intra-organizational learning take place. So the question is then, I guess, if this is what is happening, and clearly it is happening, what are the implications for learning development as a whole? And I think there are 3 things we need to take away from this kind of findings here. The first thing is that we believe that learning development needs to have a new mindset about what learning is across the organization. I think firstly, it's about understanding that formal learning we need new approaches to formal learning. It's not about churning out content, however well instructional and design, but about the benefits that social activities can have within learning. Individuals need to have the opportunity to discuss, collaborate, and share their experiences. And that it also is important to recognize that user-generated content, that's content created by the employees themselves, is just as valuable as formal content that's created by experts. And that, of course, brings in the whole area of trust, which is a big word that you're hearing about in social learning at the moment, the importance of trusting your contributors. And I'm sure there's lots we could say about that. So the first thing is new approaches to formal learning, content, moving to community. The second approach is that we believe that learning development needs to have a wider understanding of what learning is. Formal structured learning accounts for, as you can see, only a small percentage of an individual's learning in an organization, estimated around 20%. And that we've seen that social technologies allow individuals and groups to address their own learning in their own ways, and often much more speedily than can be done through learning development. Quite clearly, we're seeing that individuals and groups are saying, well, I'm not going to learning development departments for solutions to my problems because they're not quick enough to react. I can quickly set up a solution myself, can get my team, my project team to work together, and we can sort our own problems out. And it therefore means supporting all these kinds of learning within an organization. And that doesn't mean just putting in place a larger formal command and control type approach to learning systems, excuse me, but where everyone's learning is tracked and managed and monitored to death, but providing an open infrastructure that enables learning across all these different areas. And thirdly, it involves recognizing the importance of self-directed learning. When I came up with these 5 categories, my colleague in the Internet Time Alliance, Harold Jarkey, put together this diagram I've been showing you here. And once he put it together, he began to realize that social learning does require a lot of self-directed learning, as you can see from that red band through the middle there. And this in itself has great implications for learning and development, of course. In fact, I've shown this slide at a number of conferences, and I remember one particularly when somebody reacted and said, they were unhappy with this. We can't let people direct their own learning. How do we know that they're learning the right things? Quite clearly, though, people are directing their own learning. It's not something that's going to go away. People are doing this stuff, whether or not our organizations recognize it as an activity. And in fact, we're clearly seeing that self-directed learning is becoming a much more important part of learning. Only quite recently, I came across an article which said the following. I'll leave you to read it. I think the implications of this is that learning development need to concern themselves as much with helping employees become dynamic, agile, self-directed, smart learners as much as or less than creating learning solutions for them. And that's going to be the big change. Now, obviously, many employees are good self-directed learners, but others will need help to do that. So it'll be a matter of helping them, providing them with the tools and the skills, the resources to do that. But that, for me, is one of the big changes we're going to see in learning development, moving away from approaches of direction to self-direction. If we look at the systems in place within an organization, based on what I said earlier, we're seeing that within most of the activity, social media activities taking place outside the organization. The LMS can't cope with it, so obviously you're seeing free social media tools being used to support it. There may be some enterprise software being used to support different types of inter-organizational learning, but people's personal learning environments are largely taking place outside the organization. So I think another thing that implication for learning development is that we need to think about new platforms, ones that can support all these kinds of learning within an organizational framework. And by doing so, it's bringing that learning back into the organization rather than having it scattered across the internet. But as I said earlier, this kind of infrastructure is not about tracking and managing and monitoring learning, but is an open infrastructure that enables communication and collaboration and learning within the organization. And I've been working with some organizations to do exactly this, to provide that kind of enabling infrastructure that supports all these type of learning. But interestingly enough, in other organizations, such a system is often regarded as an intranet, a collaborative intranet. And so we're seeing business operations or IT departments putting these in place. And I think in those cases, what's happening, and I have seen happening, is that learning and development is getting squeezed into a corner because now the systems to support the learning are being managed, controlled, if you like, by others outside of the learning development department. So I think that's something that we need to watch carefully. So finally then, as I'm coming to the end of my time, I think the other implication that all this has for learning development is the need for new skills, new learning and development department skills. And recently I read a press release from Line that followed a European corporate forum which made this astounding statement. When I looked at what they were talking about, it was things like running webinars and things which perhaps we consider to be quite commonplace nowadays. So we're talking about social media, we're talking about the next step. So I think that is going to be an important step, that we need new skills. So clearly then, social learning is a revolution. It's changing practices. We can already see it in documented changing practices. Peter's going to be talking about the impact of social learning in BT. But I think there is clearly a need to fund, there is going to be change in the way we work and learn, and that learning and development needs to concentrate their minds on the ways that they can kind of support and understand the full range of social learning within their own organization. So that's a very brief summary of my paper that I wrote. If you'd like to find out more, you can read it in full at that address there. It's also been used to feed into the Internet Time Alliance's white paper called A Framework for Social Learning in the Enterprise. And you can get a hold of a copy there that includes a lot more of the theory about change, the way learning and working are changing and merging and so forth. At the Internet Time Alliance, you'll be asked to give your email address if you want to keep in touch with what's happening and more white papers. If, for instance, you're not interested in doing that, you just want to see this white paper, if you put /Jane on the other side of the Internet Time Alliance URL, you can go straight in and get the PDF, so no, won't capture any data for you. But that'll be valid for 5 days. But otherwise, if you just want to keep up to date, please fill in the little box there. Okay, so a very quick overview, and I'm going to pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Jane.